12 months, for instance. There's people who are in chemotherapy. There's people who have other health problems. They just can't be vaccinated. And there are always some of these people in any population. There's also people in any population where the vaccine just doesn't work. Vaccines are not perfect. After 2 doses of MMR, about 99% of people have complete immunity. Now, give or take, 99% will never get the measles. But that means that 1% are still susceptible. So in a large community, let's say, just as an example, in Disneyland in California has about 40,000 visitors a day. Of those 40,000, even if every single one of them were vaccinated, 400 are still not immune to measles, and they could pick it up. Well, 400 in a herd of 40,000, that's not that many people. If there were 1 drop of measles in the air, it's unlikely to infect anybody. But what if instead of 400 unvaccinated people, or 400 people who aren't immune, there's now 1,000 people, because several people in the communities around Disneyland don't vaccinate their children. The higher the proportion of unvaccinated people, the higher the risk of a disease transmitting, the higher the risk of the disease going from person to person. And if it goes from person to person to person to person, it's going to start picking off some people who are vaccinated, and it's going to start picking off some people who can't be vaccinated, sometimes the babies or the very sick among us. So we're really in this together. Vaccinations aren't just to protect your children, they're to protect my children, they're to protect my patients, they're to protect the whole community. The elderly, the people who are ill, the people who had a transplant. These people live among us, and we owe it to them to do the best we can to protect their lives too.
By the way, you mentioned Disneyland. It happens to be in California, where it's very easy to opt out of the vaccination as a parent for a reason that they just call philosophic.
I think they call it a personal belief exemption. Every state allows the children who have medical reasons to become exempted. That's 50 states, no problem. Some states also allow religious exemptions. And a little bit unexpected to me, because there are no major religions that have a stance against vaccines, but nonetheless there are legitimate religious exemptions in almost every state. But there are also these so-called personal belief exemptions. This is just, look, I just don't think I want to get my child vaccinated. And it doesn't matter what your personal beliefs are. If your child is not immunized against measles, you catch it very, very easily. Measles is now there was highly exactly. I wanted to get to that. So there was a lot of concern about Ebola in this country several months ago. It's a very scary illness, but Ebola was never very contagious, and a lot of us knew that it was never going to become widespread in this country because it requires direct contact with the infectious material. But with measles, even before the patient with measles has any symptoms, from 4 days before any symptoms, the air they breathe, the air they exhale can be loaded with measles virus. And the measles virus can literally float in the air for probably 2 or 3 hours in a closed room. If you're on a plane and you're sitting in the front row, and someone 40 rows back has a child with measles, cough, 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 guess what? That entire plane load of people will become infected, at least those who haven't been vaccinated, the people who haven't been protected. And so measles is far, far higher potential to become widespread than Ebola ever could have.
So when you get a news report that says the purported link between the measles vaccine and autism, I mean, that's a disservice in itself, right? Because there is no link.
There is no link, and that's not controversial anymore. But sometimes in the press, they like to present both sides of the story, and certainly there's a time when that's appropriate. When there's politically, there's 2 sides. When there's at a war, there's 2 different viewpoints. But in matters of health and science, there may be a few fringe people who believe otherwise. But the science is pretty clear that there is no autism being caused by any vaccine, especially not by the MMR vaccine. The vaccine is very, very safe, and there's no reason for parents to fear it.
And was that a little bit of the Roy Bennerock bedside manner I just got? Because if I'm a parent and I'm coming to you and I'm saying, doctor, I'm a little confused. I'm hearing these things in the news about this vaccine. My child's about to get it at school. I'm afraid.
Well, what I like to do is I agree with the fearfulness. The fear is real, and you can't just kind of blow that off and say, don't be afraid. You want to acknowledge the fear and say, I'm sorry you feel fearful, but I need to tell you that what you really need to be afraid of is measles. And this is how we know that the vaccine is safe. And you share stories about the studies that have been done. I mean, why do people think that the vaccine may have been unsafe? And we have very, very solid evidence that we can share with parents about this.
All right. Thank you very much. Even if my HMO doesn't cover this, I appreciated the time with you.
My pleasure.
You're listening to the Great Courses Radio. I'm Ed Leon. The myths about vaccinations abound. So much so that another Great Courses professor, Dr. Stephen Novella, dedicates an entire lecture to debunking the myths and extolling the virtues of vaccinations. Stephen Novella is assistant professor of neurology at the Yale School of Medicine, and he's president and co-founder of the New England Skeptical Society, a nonprofit educational organization designed to further public understanding of science. Here is his lecture on vaccinations from the great course Medical Myths, Lies, and Half-Truths. What we think we know may be hurting us. You'll find lectures from Stephen Novella on the Great Courses Plus, our new video streaming service. Just go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/SiriusXM. That's thegreatcoursesplus.com/SiriusXM and sign up for a free trial. That's right, you can check out Stephen Novella for free. Here he is.
I'm going to turn now to talking about some myths, about fears, about the safety of vaccines. Fears began mostly with one physician, a UK physician by the name of Andrew Wakefield. And he began with a 1998 paper published in The Lancet, which is a very prominent medical journal in the UK, in which he claimed that he found a correlation between autism, which is a neurodevelopmental disorder, and gastrointestinal disorders and infection with a measles virus. Now, the paper did not directly implicate vaccines, but in the subsequent press conferences and media contacts that Wakefield had, he specifically spread concerns about the MMR vaccine being linked to this gastrointestinal autism disorder or connection that he found. MMR fears spread from that point for the following decade and beyond. This is what resulted directly in the spread of fears about MMR and the decreased compliance rates. Now, Wakefield was later found to have what we call undisclosed conflicts of interest. He actually was applying for a patent for a replacement measles vaccine. And he was also being funded, given money by lawyers who were engaged in lawsuits on behalf of parents who were claiming that their children's autism were caused by the MMR vaccine. He did not disclose these financial ties. Even later, there were allegations made that the data in his original Lancet paper, or some of that data, may have been faked because it didn't square with hospital records that were then re-reviewed. In 2010, based upon these undisclosed conflicts of interest and these allegations, the Lancet actually withdrew his paper from the published record. Two other Wakefield papers were subsequently withdrawn from the record as well. Wakefield was found guilty of professional misconduct in the UK by regulators, and he was subsequently struck off, which means he no longer has a license to practice medicine in the UK. However, despite the fall from grace, if you will, of Andrew Wakefield, the damage had already been done, and fears about a correlation between the MMR vaccine and autism were already spreading. Now, in the decade following Wakefield's Lancet paper, there have been a number of studies, both epidemiological and observational and other types of studies, addressing specifically the question of, is there really a connection between the MMR vaccine and autism or other neurodevelopmental disorders? Data from Poland, the UK, Denmark, Finland, and Japan all independently found that there's no connection whatsoever between MMR and autism. So these studies show a remarkable concordance of evidence, what scientists really like to see, all the evidence pointing in the same direction, that there is a lack of association between MMR and autism. So if we're going to hypothesize that MMR, the MMR vaccine, causes autism, then children should get exposed to that vaccine prior to the onset of their autism. It's also understandable that many parents whose children aren't diagnosed with autism until they're 2 or 3, for example, after most of the vaccines will have already been given, may make the correlation in their mind that the vaccines are correlating with the autism. However, on careful examination, it turns out that autism actually has its onset long before the diagnosis is ultimately made. A 2010 study published in Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, for example, showed that signs of autism mostly appear between 6 and 12 months of age. However, the first MMR vaccine in the series is not given before 12 months of age. It's usually given either right or shortly after 12 months. Therefore, despite the timing of the diagnosis, autism has its real onset even before the MMR vaccine is given in most cases. Autism, as I said, is a neurodevelopmental disorder, which means that the nervous system does not completely develop normally. In some cases, it may be even regressive, meaning after developing to a certain point, children may regress or lose some of their development. And it primarily involves 3 areas of symptoms: social skills, language, and behavior. For the strict diagnosis, you don't need to have all of these symptoms. You only need to have a certain number of symptoms to meet the criteria. But these are the things to look for in terms of an autism diagnosis. Under the category of social skills, children with autism have what's called a marked impairment in nonverbal behaviors. So they don't make eye contact as well. They don't express themselves with facial expressions or gestures as well. In the arena of language, there is a delay, and in some severe cases, perhaps even a total lack of the development of spoken language. Although most children with autism can speak, there's just a delay in their language development. There may also be a marked impairment in the ability to initiate or sustain a conversation. In terms of behavior, there's another list of symptoms that clinicians will look for when they're considering the diagnosis. One is a preoccupation with one or more stereotyped or restricted patterns of interest. So children with autism may be fascinated with one particular thing, one particular stuffed animal, for example, or one type of toy, and they will tend to focus on that. They will be very inflexible adherents to what are called non-functional routines or rituals. They have to do certain things the same way over and over again. Now, the causes of autism are not fully understood. We do, however, have a lot of information about autism. Not knowing everything about the disease is not the same thing as knowing nothing. One thing that is most clear is that autism is strongly a genetic disorder. There is a large genetic component. In fact, researchers have discovered that children with autism are more likely to have certain variations of certain genes than children without autism, and many of those genes have to do with brain development, specifically how the brain communicates with itself, how certain parts of the brain communicate with other parts of the brain. So it makes sense that those would be the genes that would be different or abnormal, if you will, in children with a disorder like autism. There remains legitimate scientific controversy over the degree, if any, to which environmental factors trigger or exacerbate autism. I would say at this point there's no clear environmental trigger or factor, but we haven't definitively ruled it out either. Now, with the issue of what causes autism and is it correlating with certain potential triggers is the question of how many children have autism. What is the diagnosis rate? Let me first explain a couple of technical terms. One is incidence. Now, when we use the term incidence, we specifically mean the number of new cases per year. So you might express an incidence of a disease, for example, as 100 people being diagnosed per year. A prevalence is the total number of cases at any one point in time. There are 1 million people with disease X today. That's a prevalence. So now let's talk about the prevalence, the number of children at any given time with autism. Prior to 1990, prevalence estimates were about 3 children